Welcome to Rustbelt Abolition Radio. My name is Maria. In this episode, we speak with Sandro Mezzadra about the processes of bordering that extend far beyond the physical walls we usually think about when we speak of borders. Sandro is a professor of political theory at the University of Bologna and has written extensively about borders and migration, such as in a book he co-authored with Brett Neilson titled Border as Method.
Repression has ramped up inside prisons across the so-called U.S., as several departments of correction have imposed a wave of seemingly unrelated lockdowns over the last month. On April 17th, the St. Louis Correctional Facility in Gratiot County, Michigan, was put on lockdown after 50 imprisoned people broke out in fights over the course of 3 days. All state prisons in Mississippi were put on lockdown on April 20th, with the Department of Corrections citing only quote-unquote security concerns as a justification. The lockdowns bar visitation, commissary, and outdoor recreation for inmates, among other repressive measures of containment and punishment. On April 15th, riots broke out at Lee Correctional Institution in South Carolina. 7 inmates were killed and 22 seriously injured in what's being described as the worst incident of prison violence in modern South Carolina history. South Carolina's prison system, long known for its uninhabitable conditions, is one of the deadliest in the country. It took 4 hours from the beginning of the violence before emergency medical personnel were able to get into the facility and treat inmates. On April 16th, imprisoned people at the Wynn Unit in Huntsville, Texas went on hunger strike in response to being put on lockdown. Prior to the lockdown, the unit was put on medical restriction due to a norovirus outbreak, and prison staff were blocked from entering the unit. As last reported from the inside, 22 inmates were on hunger strike.
I am Alejo, here with Maria, and you're listening to Rustbelt Abolition Radio, an abolitionist media and movement building project based in Detroit, Michigan.
Today, our special guest is Sandro Mezzadra, who is an associate professor of political theory at the University of Bologna. We will be talking with him about borders, something he's written quite a bit about. Welcome, Sandro, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Sandro, let's get started. You've written extensively about the function of borders and bordering.
I did.
In contemporary capitalism, to which we'll get to soon. But before we get there, we wanted to begin by asking you about a tradition of struggle that has influenced you greatly. This tradition is called operaismo in Italian, or workerism, and is sometimes also referred to as autonomous Marxism, for example, or simply autonomism. Can you tell us a little bit about this tradition and how it has influenced your work, specifically how you think about borders and migration?
Well, this tradition has been crucial to my own political training because I joined the so-called autonomist movement in Italy when I was a kid. It was not that unusual at the end of the 70s in Italy to become politicized at 15, 16. And this was also my experience. To put it very shortly, Italian workerism has always emphasized the relevance of struggles writ large, not only explicitly political struggles, but also behaviors, practices of workers and more generally subaltern people. And this has been very important for me when I first encountered migration in Italy. Italy has a very peculiar history as far as migration is concerned, because in the 1980s, the country became a country of immigration after having been for more than a century a country of emigration, as any American citizen knows. So immigration from North Africa, immigration from Sub-Saharan Africa, immigration from Latin America was something new for us at the end of the 1980s. I grew up in Genoa, quite important industrial port city in the northwest of Italy, and the city in which I grew up was a white city. Suddenly, we realized that the city was not white anymore, that there were new people around us, that the city itself was changing in a quite dramatic way. And so I started with other comrades and friends to think about migration from the angle of workerism, in a way emphasizing the whole set of practices and behaviors that constitute the subjective side of migration, and started to think of what we came to define a bit later in terms of the autonomy of migration. But the real point that for me constitutes the connection between my own training in workerism and my political and also theoretical work on migration is precisely this idea to look at migration taking its subjective dimension as the crucial viewpoint.
We're here in Detroit, in the Rustbelt, so to speak. The Black-led class struggle in the late 1960s created some of the most radical organizations of the moment, such as the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And these struggles were happening simultaneously alongside the struggles of workers in the automobile factories of northern Italy. What is the relation between the work of Black radical thinkers such as C.L.R. James and James Boggs and Italian workerism?
Well, this relation is really important, although it is not well known. C.L.R. James, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, DRAM, were crucial sources of inspiration for Italian workerism, as well as sociological investigations in factories, particularly in Detroit, that since the 1950s were pointing to specific workers' behaviors that were not directly political, like absenteeism, showing that these behaviors were in a way expressing a refusal of the workers with respect to factory discipline. So what I was saying before about this attempt to expand the very notion of struggle beyond what is traditionally understood as struggle, also in the Marxist tradition, took the reality of factories and workers' experiences in a city like Detroit as a crucial source of inspiration. Later, such experiences as the ones that you were mentioning were particularly important for Italian workerist activists in order to get a different kind of perspective on the development of black power in the US. This connection between black power and black workers' struggles was really very important for us. But let me say something more. The question so effectively raised by organizations like DRUM, the League of Black Revolutionary Workers in Detroit, which means the question of the relation between class and race, became really important for us in the framework of the dramatic transformations produced by migration since the late 1980s, as I was saying before. Because in the history of workerism, the problem of race was not directly posited until that transformation. To be more precise, we had a kind of similar problem already in the 1960s in Italy, because worker struggles in northern Italy that you were mentioning were basically struggles of migrant workers. Which kind of migrant workers? Internal workers, workers from the south of Italy. And you may be familiar with the Southern question and its relevance in Italian history. This huge divide between an industrial north and an underdeveloped south. So this problem that was discussed in third worldism in the 1960s as a problem of the relation between the North and the Third World was in Italy an internal problem. And since the late 1950s, there was a dramatic wave of migration from the south to the north. Everywhere in the world, mass industrialization, Fordism, is associated with migration. And in Italy, this migration was internal migration from the south. And migrants from the south were kind of facing racism, both in the northern cities and in the factories. And it was the politicization of this new generation of workers from the south that spurred the exceptional cycle of worker struggles that we experienced in Italy in the 1960s. So the question was not posited, framed in terms of race, but the problem was there, and the experience of the revolutionary black organizations in Detroit, in a way, already spoke to the Italian experience.
So Detroit is a city of, like most American cities, of many borders along racial and class lines, as we've been talking about just now. Going along with that, I mean, when we speak about borders, what we think of is of a wall that stretches across hundreds of miles across land in Palestine or in the so-called United States or somewhere else. But in your writing with Brett Neilson, however, you want to sort of move away from thinking about the border solely as a wall. Why is it that we should move away simply about thinking of the border as a wall, and what its political consequences for today?
Well, of course, moving away from thinking of the border simply as a wall doesn't mean to forget that there are many walls along international borders, but also within urban spaces. So we take very seriously this kind of proliferation of walls that we have been witnessing over the last years. and we take very seriously the necessity to struggle against these borders. Nevertheless, we are convinced that the border has many manifestations that cannot be reduced to the materiality of a wall. I can say in a very simple way that I first discovered the relevance of borders participating in struggles of migration in Genoa in the early 1990s. It is participating in struggles of migration that I discovered, for instance, that the color line started to be drawn across urban spaces that historically had not been shaped by the color line. So this is a much more elusive kind of border that can also materialize in something similar to a wall, but has much wider implications. Moreover, I think that focusing our imagination on the wall leads us to lose sight of other aspects that are constitutive of any border, and first of all, of the challenge that movements of migration posit to the border. What we try to do with Brett in the book that you were mentioning is to look at the borders from the viewpoint of people on the move, of people that challenge the stability of the border. And if you start to take this point of view, then even walls become more flexible and maybe less intimidating.
Yeah, so in a way also what this implies is that this flexibility of the wall, right, this mobility also of the wall implies also that it's not simply an instrument of exclusion as well, right? I mean, this is something that you also talk about and write about. So there's a kind of continuity, there's a flipping back and forth between the wall as something and the border as something that excludes and includes. So can you tell us about sort of this dual function of the border as something that includes and excludes, and its importance for thinking about borders?
Yes, thank you for asking this question. I mean, it's apparent that borders exclude. It is apparent that this exclusion often takes terrifying forms. Death in the deserts across the US-Mexico border, thousands of people drowned in the Mediterranean in the last years. So never forget this, and let's continue to struggle against this. At the same time, I think there is a need to keep in mind that borders also shape the forms of inclusion. My friend and comrade Nicolas de Genova has written extensively on Mexican migration to the US from this point of view, showing that the border performs crucial functions of inclusion even through illegalization of migrant bodies and labor. And this is something that we have been able to show also with respect to Europe, meaning that independently of the effectiveness of the image of Fortress Europe, what has happened over the last 20 years is that more than the walls of a fortress, the European border regime has established a kind of system of dikes that have facilitated processes of what we call differential hierarchical inclusion. I repeat, also in Europe, even through illegalization of migrant bodies and migrant labor. This has important implications, of course, for the experience of these migrants, but more generally for the reshaping of citizenship and labor markets across different geographical scales in Europe as well in the US. Always keeping in mind that Europe and the US have completely different histories of migration. But nevertheless, it is possible to trace analogies, to listen to resonances between these different kind of landscapes. And let me add just one more point that is more general. Over the last couple of decades, there has been a tendency of critical thinking, of activism, to focus in a quite exclusive way on exclusion, on the struggle against exclusion. Of course, I mean, we have to continue this struggle, but we don't have to forget that also inclusion has its violent, discriminating sides. So we have, to gain the offensive again and to extend our critique and our activism beyond the territories of exclusion.
So, following this last line of thought you were mentioning, of course, thinking of borders as both exclusion and inclusion. Then, what do you make of the calls then of many activists in Europe and the United States and other parts of the world for the abolition of borders?
I have participated for many years now in no border politics. I have participated in the organization of no border camps and no border actions. This is the background of our engagement with the topic of the border. Let me say that I am a bit wary of the emphasis on the abolition of borders when this emphasis is framed in merely normative terms, meaning that, there must be no border in our ideal world. I am more interested in this dirty and world, in the real world, I'm more interested in the struggles that surround the contemporary proliferation and also the mutations of borders. And of course, in these struggles, there is a tension toward the abolition of borders. But I think that this material tension is more interesting than the imagination of a world without borders.
So the border is not only a wall, but a machine. It's a method that has the capacity both to exclude as well as to include. And we often think of prisons and the penal system more broadly solely as machines of exclusion. They define, so to speak, who is part of society and who is not, particularly here in the United States, across racial lines. So the danger with this, of course, is that inclusion means being part of a society that continues to police and punish certain gendered and racialized bodies, even outside prison walls. So given this situation, how do you see the border as method working in relation to the prison or the carceral more generally?
That's a very good question. Of course, this question must be answered in different ways with respect to different situations. The US situation is kind of peculiar in this regard, although it is also driving the development of the carceral in many parts of the world. It is something obvious that prisons have kind of function of exclusion, of bordering and containing bodies within walled spaces. I would ask whether it is possible to analyze a process of mass incarceration as the one we are confronted with in the United States from the angle of the contribution that this process makes to the reshaping of the society. I think that it is crucially important to keep an eye open on the relation between these walled spaces and the society writ large. It is crucially important to contest the kind of effect of segregation that is part and parcel of the carceral, particularly in front of conditions of mass incarceration. So which is the kind of labor, for instance, that is performed in prisons? Which is the kind of functions that prisons perform with respect to the reorganization of urban spaces, for instance, in Detroit, in the Rustbelt. These are, for me, very important questions that lead us to widen a bit the scope, to widen a bit the perspective with regard to the analysis and the contestation of the carceral.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your work and for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in. You can listen to past episodes on our website at www.rustbeltradio.org. This show is co-produced by the Rustbelt Abolition Radio crew, A. Maria, David Langstead, Catalina Rios, Tape Syed, and Alejo Stark. Original music by Bad Infinity.